In March of 2023, gruesome details of men, women, and children exhumed from mass graves in the Shakahola forest near the town of Malindi in southern Kenya spread quickly around the world. The victims were members of a suicide sect that was led by a very charismatic man named Paul Mackenzie, and shocking information about Mackenzie instructing members of his sect to starve themselves to death to transition from this life to the next terrified readers. As the story began to unfold, it was learned that parents willingly instructed their children to die first as part of a three-stage suicide pact: children first, women second, and men last. As the investigation continued, government officials came to understand that members of the sect had been brainwashed. Homicide investigators uncovered several religious tracts published from Jeffersonville, Indiana, named the Spoken Word, a phrase used by People's Temple cult leader Jim Jones during his days in the Latter Rain movement. Investigators came to the conclusion that Paul Mackenzie had used the tracts, which contained transcripts from Indiana cult leader William Branham, to brainwash his victims. Little did they know at the time that this was the same William Branham who helped launch Jim Jones' ministry in Indiana, or that Jones was a leader in Branham's sect called the Message. All they knew at the time was that the horrific scene reminded them of the tragic end of Jim Jones and his converts at the Jonestown massacre in Jonestown, Guyana. It was an observation made by several news outlets covering the tragedy in Kenya. By August, officials in Kenya uncovered almost 430 bodies. Of interest among the spoken word tracts and sermon transcripts recovered from the scene of the Shakahola massacre was William Branham's 1964 sermon entitled The Oddball. In 1964, William Branham sanctioned another splinter group that developed in Prescott, Arizona, under cult leader Leo Mercer. About the same time that Jim Jones began working with William Branham in May 1955, Branham also began working with Leo Mercer and his partner, Gene Goad. The two men recorded Branham's sermons, which eventually were transcribed and published as the spoken word tracts that Mackenzie used to brainwash his followers. After Mercer and Goad had established their commune in Arizona called The Park, Branham preached his blessings in a sermon that he entitled The Oddball. It was a theme used often in Branham's speeches, giving listeners the notion that behaving according to the cult's unusual rules and behaviors was to be praised. What happened at the commune, however, was not praiseworthy. Though the commune's tragic end was not so deadly as other splinter groups of Branham's message sect, it bore many similarities to its more destructive counterparts. Like Mackenzie's sect, children at the park were victimized, and parents were brainwashed to either support or participate in their abuse. Children in the commune were brutally beaten by multiple elders under Mercer's command, some bleeding through their underwear, while others were stripped naked and forced to march around the compound. Some children were mutilated or molested, also naked, and forced to run through the camps with sand forced into their rectums. In severe cases of abuse, elders stood over the children, alternating the lashes between the men. Fortunately, the park imploded before the splinter group had radicalized to the point of having a climactic end and became fully extinct with Mercer's death. Many people in William Branham's message cult of personality and its various splinter groups are not aware of the evils that happened in the park and other communes led by ministers radicalized by Branham's teachings. Though Mackenzie himself may have been aware of this history and harnessed the power of the neurolinguistic programming contained in Branham's speeches, it is very unlikely that any of his victims were. As it relates to the radicalization of ministers and their followers, however, this particular sermon, The Oddball, is interesting only due to an unfortunate parallel. One splinter group of William Branham's message cult was radicalized through a sermon transcript of William Branham praising another splinter group on the other side of the earth. In his sermons and educational videos, Paul Mackenzie taught William Branham's serpent seed doctrine, which was derived from Wesley Swift's Christian identity doctrine. According to Swift and Branham, the biblical Eve from the Garden of Eden mated with the serpent, believed to be the devil, to produce a second, evil bloodline into creation. The descendants of Eve's son Cain, according to this doctrine, were the children of the curse, sometimes referred to as the curse of Ham, due to the genealogy described in Swift's doctrine. This doctrine was used to radicalize white supremacists of the 1960s and beyond. White supremacists believed that this curse was black skin. Mackenzie and his followers, all having black skin, were likely unaware that they were being radicalized with theology developed for white supremacy. When William Branham rebranded Swift's doctrine as the serpent seed, he did so very strategically. Branham removed the words black and Jew from Swift's doctrine and convinced his converts to believe the pseudo-archaeological and pseudo-genealogical history of the two-seed doctrine. By gradually and covertly introducing Swift's teaching to participants of his revivals, Branham was able to push the idea of Swift's and other white supremacists' vision of impending race war. Initially, William Branham removed the racial elements of Swift's theology, though he traced the genealogy of the evil bloodline through Ham, the son of the biblical Noah, which many Christians of the era believed to be the origin of the black race. Once this was established, Branham introduced his hybriding doctrine, adding the racial component. According to this doctrine, a white person who produced offspring with a black person had produced a hybrid person, and that person could not enter the kingdom of heaven. Branham was eventually sanctioned for spreading this doctrine, and 300 ministers denounced it as abominable heresy. According to the historical timeline, it appears that the serpent seed doctrine led to Jim Jones abandoning the Latter-Rain movement. Understanding the timeline of the intersection between Jim Jones and the formation of People's Temple, as it relates to William Branham's involvement with the Latter-Rain movement, is critical to understand how Paul Mackenzie's suicide sect could seem so vastly different from People's Temple. Both were splinter groups of the Latter-Rain message, commonly referred to as the quote, message sect of Pentecostalism in the mid to late 1950s. While both were results of splits from William Branham's Latter-Rain healing revivals, core doctrines and interests within the two splinter groups were not aligned. William Branham used multiple versions of a stage persona in an attempt to appeal to very different crowds. And as those crowds and heads of the organizations gathering those crowds began to sanction Branham, the stage persona shifted quickly to adapt. In one version of the stage persona, for example, William Branham accepted the doctrine of the Holy Trinity to appeal to Trinitarian denominations of Christian faith. In other versions, Branham denounced the Trinitarian doctrine as being inspired by Satan himself, the doctrine of demons. By doing so, Branham could appeal to the Oneness Pentecostal crowds that had rejected the Trinity. From its inception, the Latter-Rain movement was doctrinally aligned with William Branham and Reverend Franklin Hall. Hall was recognized for his book, Atomic Power with God Through Fasting and Prayer, which appears to have been closely aligned with Paul Mackenzie's suicide sect. Mackenzie believed that fasting could achieve the ultimate power with God. For Mackenzie, fasting was the vehicle that would transfer a convert from this life into heaven. In 1978, Jim Jones denounced the practice of fasting as a worthless spiritual explanation for not having enough food. Jones was somewhat aligned with Mackenzie in that he threatened fasting as a weapon of protest in March of 1978, but obviously did not choose it as the means to escape life on earth. By the time that Jim Jones joined the Latter-Rain healing revivals and fell under William Branham's influence, the version of William Branham's stage persona had shifted such that it was against the widespread fasting practices. This was not always the case, however. When the fasting doctrine of Franklin Hall was extremely popular among latter-rain leaders and converts, William Branham frequently advertised fasting as a spiritual experience. According to that version of Branham's stage persona, the blood flowed to the brain and opened the door to a supernatural experience. Long after Jim Jones had separated from Branham, the stage persona shifted once more. Branham was more aligned with the fasting doctrine in the years leading up to his death, claiming that members of the church should join in the fasts for powerful supernatural experiences. In fact, Branham claimed that if an entire church joined in fasting together, such power could result in raising a dead person back to life. Another example of William Branham's ever-changing doctrinal foundations resulting in very different influences on People's Temple and Paul Mackenzie's sect is that of Branham's doctrines about education. Jones was very vocal in support of education, especially among the African nations. Paul Mackenzie, on the other hand, strictly forbade education. According to Mackenzie, education was satanic. While both sect leaders are polar opposite in their positions, both are fully aligned with William Branham's theology based on Branham's timeline. When preaching with Jim Jones at the Cato Tabernacle in June 1956, William Branham praised education and announced that he wished that he had a seminary degree. In the 1964 version of Branham's stage persona, however, Branham took a firm stance against education and seminaries. According to Branham, ministers trained in seminaries were given instruction, quote, interpreted by Satan. This is largely due to William Branham's close ties with leaders of white supremacy during the 1960s as the civil rights movement began to push for equal opportunity and racially integrated schools. William Branham was ordained by, mentored by, and kept close connections to the second-in-command of the 1915 Ku Klux Klan, Reverend Roy E. Davis. While working with Jones, Branham admitted that he first came in contact with the Christian identity doctrine in Davis's Pentecostal church through Elder George DeArc. Though in that version of the stage persona, Branham claimed to have rejected it. Long before working with Jones, however, Branham taught the fundamentals of Christian identity. He claimed that Jews were the, quote, servants, and to be separate from other Christians. He taught Wesley Swift's genealogy of the two-seed doctrine, pointing to the offspring of Ham, believed to be the nations of Africa, for the evil seed as early as 1953. Though William Branham appears to have concealed his personal beliefs towards the superiority of people with white skin while working with Jones, it is clear that the Klan had a deep influence on Branham's doctrine. As Roy Davis rose through the ranks of the third wave of the Ku Klux Klan to become the Imperial Wizard, Branham's white supremacy doctrine became more openly taught in his revivals. In 1959, Roy Davis was chosen to be the Imperial Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan in Dallas by Imperial Wizard Eldon Edwards. Davis was widely discussed in national news media during this time, and Branham frequently dropped Davis's name in his healing revivals. Branham wanted his listeners to know that he had a long history with the Imperial Wizard. As the Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacy groups in the 1960s rose against the education system for the push towards racial integration, Branham began shifting his doctrines towards alignment with the agenda. Branham claimed that education, civilization, and the modern trend of the day was, quote, of the devil. He claimed that the school system was producing a large percentage of mentally retarded students. He openly declared himself to be a segregationalist and taught that one cannot be a Christian if they were not. His hybriding doctrine transitioned to include the public school system in the Theology, blasting politicians for trying to, quote, ruin the race of people, because African Americans, quote, got better schools than whites. Branham labeled civil rights leaders such as Martin Luther King as, quote, communist, and was very outspoken against students such as Air Force veteran James Meredith, who fought for equal opportunity. Prior to the open alignment with white supremacy, the versions of William Branham's stage persona were vastly different and influenced a wide range of people and movements. Like Jim Jones, the Children of God founder Moses David Berg was a latter-rain convert deeply influenced by William Branham. The Children of God was famous for their happy hookers for Jesus, women that recruited men into the cult through sex. Berg was a Christian and Missionary Alliance minister ousted from the organization due to allegations of sexual misconduct. After Berg was defrocked, Branham issued a prophetic blessing on his ministry, just as he had done for Jones in 1956, and he inspired Berg to teach junior classes. This eventually led to the formation of the Children of God sect. Until his death in 1994, Berg continued to promote William Branham's prophetic ministry, publishing literature about the life story accounts that William Branham used for his stage persona, teaching Branham's version of the doctrine about UFOs, spreading news about Branham's halo photograph, and angelic commission, and more. Some of those doctrines, such as the doctrine of otherworldly dimensions and UFOs, carried forward to the same version of stage persona in use when Jim Jones worked with Branham in the latter-rain healing revivals. Like Berg, Jones remained fully aligned with those extraterrestrial doctrines. Berg, however, was converted under an earlier version of the stage persona than Jones, and was aligned with the white supremacy. Berg openly stated that he was, quote, an anti-Semite because God is. Yes, I'm a racist because God is. Interestingly, splinter groups of Berg's Children of God sect, such as the Jesus Christians, openly showed their support for Paul Mackenzie's doomsday theology during Mackenzie's arrest in 2019 for radicalizing children with Christian extremism. There were several black members of People's Temple, and Jones supported and promoted equal opportunity. This was not the case, however, with many splinter groups of William Branham's message cult. As unusual as it sounds, Branham's doctrines of white supremacy are widely adopted among converts in the nations of Africa, including converts with black skin, and some openly teach the racist version. In the Ivory Coast, for example, black message sect leader Cacao Felipe prides himself in being fully aligned with the latest version of William Branham's stage persona, and he openly teaches the white supremacy doctrines. Felipe is fully aware that they were intended for purposes of discrimination against people with black skin, and he instructs his converts to accept the discrimination. It is, according to Felipe, the, quote, divine decree of the white man for peace and stability. Felipe was introduced to Branham's teachings through latter-rain cult leader Ewald Frank, and considers himself to be a disciple of Frank rather than a disciple of Branham. Frank was instrumental in helping to establish various sects devoted to William Branham's doctrine in multiple parts of the world, including South America. Frank has deep ties to the infamous Colonia Dignidad, where hundreds of people were killed and buried in mass graves. In Africa, Frank's influence reaches as far west as the Ivory Coast and as far east as Nairobi, Kenya, near Paul Mackenzie's suicide sect. Felipe claimed that William Branham laid the initial foundation of the doctrine, which he called the evening light, and that Frank furthered William Branham's doctrine with the midnight cry, for which Felipe's sect is named. That foundation includes the Christian identity doctrine of Wesley Swift, the same racist theology used by Paul Mackenzie to brainwash his sect of converts. Like Jones and Berg, Felipe adopted Branham's doctrines of dimensions and UFOs. Felipe is recognized, however, for the hate speech and has been arrested multiple times. There are literally thousands of similar sects spread around the world who are dedicated to Branham's teaching or influenced by Branham's doctrine. The vast majority of them are somewhat benign when compared to sects like Jones, Mackenzie, Mercier, Berg, Felipe, and Colonia Dignidad. Some have been radicalized, but in much different ways. Some sects terrorize women on the streets for not adhering to the Pentecostal dress code. Others abuse their power over brainwashed converts to have sex with them, often through polygamy, sometimes rape. Leaders of splinter groups use their power for financial schemes, money laundering, and organizing assaults on members of other faiths. There is no way to predict when or how the radicalized sects will lead their members into a climactic event, such as the Jonestown Massacre or the Shakahola Forest Massacre. But one thing is for certain: all sects that have been radicalized by Branham's doomsday theology are at risk.